He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. Just a heads up, listeners, this episode contains some adult language.
Previously on the agency.
Maybe the guy that I piggybacked in wasn't successful, no matter how hard he tried. Maybe he was successful, and maybe they wasted a lot of time and effort on it. Would they necessarily blame Vladimir?
That depends how you define World War III. We could very well define what's happening as a World War III.
You know, it's the luck of the draw. It's the sort of thing that happened. However, you know, maybe his vulnerabilities were identified by Hansen, or more likely by Ames, and he might have gotten the shit. So with the dead-end technology one, that's what we did. I wheeled in this guy, and then I was out of it. That was it, gone. Don't know what happened.
Do we know whether they embraced the dead-end technology and wasted a lot of time with it?
I was...
Get to know that?
No, I don't get to know. I was told unofficially that we'd had a success there, but I don't know, but I think that was blown, after it had been going for a little while, by Aldrich Ames.
Aldrich Ames, or Rick Ames, had worked for CIA in various guises since the early 1960s. He'd risen to a lead role in the Southeast Asia division of the Soviet and East European section when he began passing secrets to the KGB in 1985. But this wasn't discovered until 1994.
And by then, Kit Bennett was long gone from CIA and New Zealand's SIS. He only found out that his operation against Vladimir was probably blown by Ames through an unofficial contact.
Well, after I left the agency and I met up with an old friend of mine, and I said, it was after Ames had been arrested, because that was after my time. Someone must have told me that they thought Ames had done it. And he did another operation of Jamie's too. He blew.
Did he?
Yeah. And I said, let him out, I'll be there to meet him. He said, and this guy said, hey, Kit, pick a number and get in line.
Okay, so this is being told as something of a funny story, but emotions run pretty deep here.
Yeah, it's hard to be sure exactly what happened with Vladimir and the operation against the GRU. Aldrich Ames began his betrayal in 1985, but it went on for 9 years. It was probably the worst penetration of the CIA in its entire history, and the wider understanding of what happened would take decades to piece together. This is a clip from ABC's Nightline in 2014.
On June 13th, 1985, Rick Ames gave the KGB a list of every known human asset the CIA had in the Soviet Union. The list had 20 names on it. Within a year, 10 of those people were executed.
And Ames also betrayed people run by other Western intelligence agencies, including the KGB colonel and Daniel family friend, Oleg Gordievsky, who was an MI6 asset. We'll come back to him.
Yeah, although Ames is only able to throw Gordievsky under the bus because of some pretty bad behaviour from CIA themselves. They shouldn't have known Gordievsky's name. Very few people at MI6 knew his name. It was highly secret for exactly this reason. You've got to keep maximum security for the safety of the person who has entrusted you with their life. MI6 had shared the information they were getting from him with CIA and probably other Five Eyes partners. But Gordievsky himself was known only by a code name to them.
But Gordievsky's intelligence is good. It's so good and so important. I mean, he's credited with turning the world back from the brink of nuclear war in 1983. This was during the NATO Able Archer exercises. CIA are briefing President Ronald Reagan using this intelligence, and they find it embarrassing that they don't know who the source actually is, and they're probably also a bit nervous that the Brits have been sucked in by the KGB. It's happened before.
Yes, it has. So CIA analysts pull together all the information they have from this source, and by cross-checking with what they know from their side, they end up being able to put a real identity to the code name. And so Aldrich Ames is able to pass that on to the KGB. Which brings us to this little nugget which so surprised me.
He did another operation of Jamie's too. He blew.
Did he?
Yeah.
So remember, this is Jamie Mercer, not his real name, the guy who was my mother's boss on the Russia desk at the SIS, who I knew as a kid, and who specialised in recruitment.
Yeah, he tried to bring over the KGB resident, the Soviet equivalent of the CIA chief of station. This is Dmitry Razgovorov on Arrow Street in Wellington after the arrest of Bill Such. And you said he used to get a Christmas card every year from the CIA. That's nice.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I didn't see it myself. But if Aldrich Ames, a CIA traitor, is able to blow one of his operations, it might well have been the one that earned him that Christmas card every year. In any case, it is pretty interesting, but given all we've heard, perhaps not that surprising, that Ames seems to have had access to details of an operation that involved New Zealand's SIS. Now, the story remains sensitive. Kip Bennett doesn't want to talk to us about this because he says it's not his story to tell. And while it wouldn't be news to any of the intelligence services involved, the people themselves are civilians, and they wouldn't want their story out there.
Right, and while we might not know any more about it than that, it does show how tight those bonds are, or at least were, between SIS and CIA. We'll hear more in the next episode about where that's at today. But it also underlines that the espionage game is played for pretty high stakes. The consequences, they aren't always the same. It depends on whose rules you're playing by.
A journalist once asked Oleg Gordievsky, our greatest defector, said, well, you did the same thing. And Gordievsky said, no, I didn't. The people that I fingered went to prison. The people that he fingered were shot in the back of the head. And there's a bit of a difference, So we're the good guys.
This is a job where manipulation and deception and a certain amount of cynicism all go with the territory. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's a moral equivalence between the two sides. From Bird of Paradise Productions and RNZ, this is The Agency. I'm John Daniel.
And I'm Guy Espiner. This is episode 5, Treachery. Who do you trust? Who can you trust? In this episode, we're going to look at what is perhaps the most important question of all for an intelligence service. You have to trust some people to get anything done. But if you trust the wrong person, well, that can sometimes do enormous damage.
You expect the opposition to be acting against you. But if your own people do it, the blow is that much harder. Not just because they've had access to your secrets, but also because it spreads fear and mistrust. Has anyone else been turned?
At the same time, it's great if you can get someone from the other side to come over.
Yeah, the recruitment in place of Vladimir that Kip Bennett was working on, that would have been very useful. But it's also a question that occurs at a political level. And we're going to hear from a former high-ranking CIA official how a breach of trust might apply there.
At the very highest political level, where it involves the so-called leader of the free world.
And we'll also hear how New Zealand and its other Five Eyes partners might need to de-risk their alliance with Donald Trump's CIA.
We often hear people who go from the west to the east referred to as traitors, whereas the ones who come across in the other direction are just defectors. The language, of course, is emotional. You could say it's a bit like two sides of the coin, being the terrorists and the freedom fighter.
I think the point is, if you're the one getting stabbed in the back, you really feel it. Here's Tim Weiner from the New York Times talking about Aldrich Ames, who he interviewed and would go on to write a book about.
Yeah, the book was called Betrayal, and Tim Weiner was not impressed by Rick Ames.
This guy was so bad at being a spy that, he did everything but hang a sign around his neck, blinking in neon, saying, I am a spy for the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And by then the Cold War was over, but the damage this did to the CIA and its ability to conduct espionage against Russia and to its reputation lasted for years and years and years.
And he effectively, I think he initially put up some sort of ethical or geopolitical argument, but in the end, he did it for the money, right? And I think he admitted as much to you, didn't he?
Listen, I interviewed Ames shortly after he was arrested in the county jail outside Washington. and continued to interview him by telephone. He called me. We spoke for about 8 hours. And yes, at first he put out this grandiose, idea that we had cleaned the Soviets' clock during the latter years of the Cold War. And he wanted to level the playing field. He wanted to lift up the hood of history and tinker with the engine. But that was all nonsense. He did it for the money, and eventually after some not too gentle questioning on my part, he admitted that that's why he'd done it for the money.
Ames received millions from the KGB over the course of the decade he was working for them.
And because of that, we lost a number of agents, assets.
Susan Miller, the former head of CIA counterintelligence, worked on CIA's Moscow station in the 1980s. Their assets, Soviets working for them inside the system, kept turning up arrested or dead.
We had known, I didn't know this before, I was too junior, but we, meaning the CIA and the FBI, had known that there was somebody spying for Russia or for the Soviet Union. And Ames was one of there's usually a list, like here, it could be these 20 people because they all had access to this information.
Susan Miller worked in cover as a receptionist at the American Embassy in Moscow. One of her tasks involved handing over large payments to Soviet sources, including someone CIA hoped would reveal how their network was being rolled up. But there were some challenges involved in that.
How do you pay these people inside the Soviet Union when hard currency was illegal there? Meaning we could not pay them in US dollars.
Some days she was carrying bags of gold and diamonds around.
There's diamonds in the Soviet Union, there's gold. And so we would pay them in gold or diamonds sometimes.
Just to pick up on the Aldrich Ames story, Susan.
What a putz.
Yeah. Not a great moment for CIA counterintelligence either, is it? Because it's a few years of him doing that.
No, and here's the thing, is that my understanding, again, I wasn't intimately involved in this, but what I found out about this a little bit later is that we knew we were bleeding some information, because when I was in Moscow, we had been losing once in a while an asset would get arrested. But then what happened was we had a source actually that was being run while I was in Moscow.
This is Prologue, is it?
Yeah, this is Prologue. Yeah, 100%.
Prologue is a kind of Russian version of Aldrich Ames, a KGB officer who approached CIA's Moscow chief of station on a train in May of 1987 and, in exchange for money, began to hand over information on how the KGB were neutralising CIA assets.
But he's not telling them everything, is he?
No, just the opposite, it turns out. CIA are very jumpy, having lost so many people, good people, and so they're desperate for that information, which is probably why they get sucked in.
So this is what we call a dangle, right?
Yeah, a very successful dangle, because Prologue is telling them lies, and CIA is convinced enough by them to dial down their own search for a traitor.
Now, this Prologue operation is carried out directly by the chief of station, with the information tightly held. So people like Susan were working on it, but without knowing everything about the case.
We knew there was a sensitive case called Prologue. None of us were given any information on it because that was at the top, because we were all junior officers, right? But a couple of times we were asked to go do a dead drop, and we're not telling you what it's for, and just go do it. And one of those, as my understanding from, talking to my then boss later, is one of those was actually for Prologue.
In fact, Prologue is all about covering up for Aldrich Ames so he can continue to work in place for the KGB.
Prologue tells CIA that their assets have been discovered because they made mistakes. They missed surveillance on them during a meeting or whatever. Ultimately, they gave themselves away, when in reality it was all because Aldrich Ames wanted money, so he'd handed over a list of names.
And one of those names was Oleg Gordievsky.
There's been some debate around that in terms of the timeline, but I asked the former chief of CIA counterintelligence. There's some discussion still as to whether Aldrich Ames was able to give up Oleg Gordievsky to the KGB. Do you have any particular insights on that?
Whether he gave up Gordievsky?
Yeah.
I believe we thought he did. That's what I remember.
Good enough for me. Now remember, Gordievsky manages to get out thanks to an MI6 escape plan. It's a shame because he's about to become the resident in London.
So this would have been like chief of station for the KGB in London.
Yeah, so that would have put him in a very powerful position. But anyway, he gets away from the KGB after they brought him in for interrogation, presumably because they want to check that Ames's information is good. It's only the previous month that he's approached the KGB in America, and even they can't go around bumping off their own people without checking out the story behind it.
And within a year, Gordievsky is here in New Zealand on the first of 4 trips.
Yeah, the nice man from the KGB, as my mother put it, clearly likes it here from what he writes in his book, Next Stop Execution. He says 1986 was his first visit of 4. Obviously, he does a lot of talking in the UK and the US. He has meetings with Thatcher and Reagan, and he goes to CIA where he talks with their Soviet teams. Ironically, one of the people he's talking to is Aldrich Ames.
Yeah, because Ames won't be busted for years. And just in terms of that connection to New Zealand, it's pretty interesting here, isn't it? Because while he comes here 4 times, he only goes to Australia twice. And he says the work he did in New Zealand was, quote, particularly important because the country had been under massive propaganda and ideological attack from the KGB. And he says, quote, the ruling Labour Party seemed unaware of the extent to which the fabric of their society was being damaged by subversion.
Yeah, it's a big call, isn't it? Now, David Lange pushes back on this at the time Gordievsky's book is published in 1995, and there's a suggestion that Gordievsky, as an MI6 agent, is running an alarmist line that suits Margaret Thatcher's Britain. But we looked at this in episode 3 of The Service. Sir Geoffrey Palmer, the Labour Deputy Prime Minister at the time, talked about a full court press from the KGB.
At the time I was involved in this, the Soviet Union in its dying days was extremely active in New Zealand and trying to penetrate our systems. There was something of a blitz of it, as far as I could see, and we had a lot of problems with that.
And what were they up to? I mean, they were funding parties or funding the...
Well, they were doing all sorts of things, and they were trying to get hold of people who were sometimes members of the government, sometimes supporters of it, sometimes influential people in other areas, and they had a sort of full court press going, as far as I could see, my memory of it.
And this time, we actually have the notes from a 2-hour meeting that Oleg Gordievsky held with Prime Minister David Lange on August the 27th, 1986. These are from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. We'll put them up online. I suspect they wouldn't have been released at our end.
Yeah, the director of the New Zealand SIS was there, as well as someone from MI6. David Lange starts out quite bullish. The notes say he expresses contempt for a recent offer of military cooperation between the USSR and New Zealand by the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister during a trip here. Lange reckons New Zealanders have way too much common sense to be bamboozled by the Soviets. He says there's no chance New Zealand as a country would willingly hand over the country to Soviet domination.
And Gordievsky says that's not how it works. Moscow doesn't imagine that it will turn New Zealand into a client state, but it is delighted about the nuclear-free zone in the Pacific because that will limit American military effectiveness. It's working on influencing the Labour Party, and he cites invitations to visit the Soviet Union that have been accepted by the Labour Party President and General Secretary, and says there'll be more like that. Visits not just to the USSR, but also to Cuba and Nicaragua, places that are aligned with the Soviet regime.
Gordievsky says after the Labour Party was elected back in 1984, the KGB ordered its people to find contacts and agents who would be willing to go to New Zealand and other countries of the South Pacific region to promote anti-nuclear peace policies.
By this point, Lange seems to be starting to get it. He says the biggest problem he's having with his party is that the Soviets have recently declared a moratorium on nuclear testing, and he's under pressure now to issue statements supporting Soviet policy. And he says the Pacific Islands will be particularly vulnerable to Soviet influence. The notes end with him saying the New Zealand government will need to pay more attention to countering communist-inspired activities in the Pacific.
Now, Kit Bennett, he didn't get to meet Oleg Gordievsky when he was out in New Zealand. By that point, he says he'd fallen out of favour pretty seriously with the service. We'll get to how that all unfurled in the next episode. But he did have dealings with other defectors who were clearly put to work by the intelligence services.
There was an East European guy when I was in training. I had to do a practice recruitment of him, and he was a defector. And I was only ever told a cover name for him, so I think he was from Czech intelligence service. I think it's where he was from. I'm not 100% sure. And he play acted the defector and I. So we had a brief meeting, and I was told to ask him to lunch.
So over a number of weeks in Washington, Kit Bennett practices recruitment techniques on a former spy from the Eastern Bloc.
To the point where I pitched him. And he was reporting back all the time on how well I was doing, and then afterwards there was a great big debrief, and, which he didn't come to. I was hoping to meet him in real life, but I didn't get to meet him in real life. Only ever got to meet him in cover.
In an environment where deception was routine, relationships were always hard to gauge.
My friend, the defector, was a man named Yuri Nosenko. He's a really interesting guy. He was a chap who defected just after the assassination of Kennedy. And he was the guy that came and told the agency that Lee Harvey Oswald was not because the Soviets were terrified.
Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated US President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. From 1959 to May of 1962, he was living in Russia. His wife was Russian, and his son had been born there.
Yeah, it wouldn't take much for Cold War paranoia to link his stay in Russia to the assassination.
Yuri said he walked in and the KGB were frightened of him. They thought he was barking, so they didn't want to touch him. And I don't think they did. They didn't recruit him. But they were very keen to make sure the Americans knew that they hadn't recruited him.
So Yuri Nosenko reinforces that idea that the KGB had nothing to do with the assassination of Kennedy. Although, when you think about it in the context of Cold War mistrust, they would say that, wouldn't they?
And this is the era of The Manchurian Candidate, the 1962 film starring Frank Sinatra about an American soldier brainwashed by the communists into assassinating a presidential candidate. This comes out just a year before Kennedy is assassinated. And if you mix Hollywood sensationalism with CIA skepticism and thin-sounding Russian denials, it's quite a cocktail. And telling it straight seems to have been an issue for Yuri Nosenko to begin with.
Yuri told so many stories that no one was ever quite sure what was true. And so it was suggested that Yuri was a dangle, that he wasn't a genuine defector.
In the mid-1960s, CIA counterintelligence, led by James Jesus Angleton, the Wilderness of Mirrors guy, is at the height of its Cold War paranoia. And Yuri Nosenko gets locked up and interrogated for years.
And he was treated very, very badly. This is all before my time. Then they decided that he was, in fact, genuine. But there were still some Americans that believed that he was a false flag and that he wasn't a real defector.
Now, there's still discussion today that Nosenko may have been a triple agent. But regardless, he came out to New Zealand in the 1970s.
And I spent a day with him. I actually took him for a bit of a drive around town. And then he said, come on, we'll have a drink.
So a bottle of vodka was procured.
And he took off the cap. And he looked at me and he squeezed it. Looked at me and squeezed it. I thought, oh, no.
And drink was taken and the frontiers of knowledge were pushed back.
Anyway, we were talking and he said, I was a little bit of my bad Russian, and he said, "Не срите мне в глаза." And I said, what's that? He said, you know what that is? And he said, do you not understand? He said, literally, it means don't piss in my eye, but it means, He said, can you swear in Russian? I said, no. He said, well, you can't speak Russian. So he said, we're in this hotel room sitting on the floor, and I've still got the notes, big yellow sheets of paper with his scrawl on it saying, Hui. They're teaching me all this Russian. Shit, I was drunk.
Apologies to the Russian speakers in our audience. Kit Bennett says they had a less liquid lunch some years later in the US.
When I was in Washington one time, I said, does he ever come up? And they said, yeah, well, he does. We can always get him up if you'd like to meet him. So he and I went off and had lunch together, and it was good. I really liked him.
There were a number of these Soviet defectors who came out to New Zealand to meet with the SIS over the years, but Kit Bennett says they weren't all as chatty as Nasenko. Another KGB officer who had defected to Britain's MI5 in 1971 was Oleg Lialin. Lialin posed as a textile buyer while actually belonging to Department V, responsible for sabotage and assassinations. Apparently, he had a different vibe.
And Lialin came out. I didn't like him, and he didn't like me. I just didn't kind of warm to the man. But I liked Yuri. He was good.
Kit Bennett says meeting these defectors would often set him thinking.
One of the things that you often think about in this is, they always say everybody has their price. And, I often used to think about, what is my price? What is it that would make me turn? What would have turned me to work for the Russians?
And what was your answer?
I don't have an answer. I don't know.
He says money would not have been a motivation.
You could have offered me millions of dollars and that wouldn't have affected me.
The way Kit Bennett tells it, he was running on the kind of idealism that meant he wasn't for sale.
But I was always conscious of the fact that they were the other side, that they were the baddies and that we were the goodies.
The Cold War finished years ago now. It all ended, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the sense that the West had won, that liberal democracies were a kind of logical endpoint for societies.
But just a decade later, America met with the shock and awe of September the 11th.
I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on this thing. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you.
Please crash into Alpha 4. Looks like it went into the Pentagon.
And with the subsequent American-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it wasn't quite so clear that CIA were still the good guys. In a fight against an enemy fueled with their own brand of idealism, CIA had gone looking for additional leverage to extract information, and that had become its own form of betrayal.
Good evening. A scathing report issued today details what the CIA did to terrorism suspects in the name of 9/11 and in the war on terrorism.
This is from NBC News in 2014. The US Senate had just released what became known as its torture report, detailing the horrific abuse of prisoners that had been sanctioned at the highest levels of CIA, driven by politicians, in particular the Vice President Dick Cheney, who refused to accept methods like waterboarding were in fact torture, describing them instead as enhanced interrogation techniques.
American conduct of the so-called War on Terror had drawn the entire defence and security apparatus to a very dark place, away from its professed values as the good guys. Here's President Barack Obama responding to the CIA torture report.
Even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks. We did some things that were contrary to our values.
War demands brutal calculations. What are you willing to do to keep your people safe?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see how lines can get blurred when you're charged with defending a country under attack, but you do need to be clear about how far you'll go to reach your goals. New Zealand has lined up alongside Ukraine after Russia's invasion of 2022. And while we're part of Five Eyes, that's an intelligence sharing partnership, and while we work with NATO, we don't technically belong to any defence alliances.
Which might be worth thinking about if you're poking the Russian bear, although our Russia expert sounds reassuring on this.
New Zealand, with all respect, I'm sure is not the first priority for either Mr. Putin or Kremlin or the security apparatus.
This is Professor Ruben Azizian, the former Soviet and Russian ambassador to New Zealand, who became an academic specialising in security studies at Massey University. He says the current Russian regime is under so much pressure with the Ukraine war, they don't have the resources to project power into the Pacific. We benefit from what he calls a luxury of distance, where geography plays in our favour. But the internet has led to radical change and new opportunities for Russian interference that undermine the West. And we put that to him when we spoke with him in November of 2025.
It's more the attack on Western liberal democracies in terms of disinformation and misinformation that is spreading, particularly through the internet. It's something that Russia and the Soviet Union used to be very good at in the past, and it seems to be something that they're doing now to huge effect. And as a result, we're seeing a sort of polarisation and erosion of trust in institutions in the West. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's a very good point. The way the intelligence community, I think, works in Russia and perhaps many other places, the tactic has changed. The form of penetration and influence has changed. So I'm reminded a few days about the Such case.
Professor Azizian is referring to the Such case, remember, where former senior civil servant Bill Such was picked up by Kit Bennett one night in Karori meeting the KGB resident, although he was ultimately found not guilty of violating the Official Secrets Act.
Yeah, for anyone who still harbours any lingering doubts about the Bill Such story, it's worth noting that this is the former Soviet and Russian ambassador referencing it unequivocally as an influence operation where a New Zealander is working for the benefit of Moscow.
That I think everything is possible. It could be new such cases, maybe. Although we have different type of such cases here already, right, in New Zealand. We have some in the Russian community who have basically collected funding to support Russian army in Ukraine. I think there was an insurance company in New Zealand that was insuring the Dark Fleet. So whether they are connected directly with the intelligence community or not, we don't know. But the form of this influence has changed. We read New Zealand SIS reports. Russia, I think, is mentioned alongside North Korea, maybe China, as countries that are very proactive in cyber and information inference. So with that caveat, I will say, yes, definitely, distance is not a problem. And I would think that Russia is very active because Russia wants to be heard, seen, and one of the ways by doing that is degrading and discrediting the Western democracy and Western values.
Ruben Azizian says while this plays out now through social media, Russia Today, the Russian state English language broadcast television network that was dropped here in New Zealand after Russia invaded Ukraine, illustrates how the strategy for influencing Western democracies has evolved.
I mean, you compare Russia Today program with Soviet TV programs. Soviet TV programs were all about how great Soviet Union is, and most Soviet people who were watching that were turned off TV at the time because they see that was a complete lie. But Russia Today doesn't praise necessarily Russia. Russia Today tries to discredit the West. And of course, the West has so many shortcomings. I mean, this is a democracy. This is people don't like each other. People can compete with each other. You have all sorts of issues. And Russian propaganda uses that. So in that sense, infiltration through social media, other ways into New Zealand society, democratic values, is part of the business of intelligence communities.
The lead figure in the Russian intelligence community is the president, the man who started out as a KGB officer and under whose regime multiple suspicious deaths have occurred of journalists, dissidents, defectors, in fact, anyone who challenges him.
Now, if this feels like a walk from our CIA story, stick with us. We've gone out on a bit of a loop, but we're about to come back to it. Let's just remind ourselves that the Russian state moved from the communist politics of the Soviet Union to a country that is at least nominally democratic. But the state security services remain very similar to the Soviet era. The KGB has been split into the domestic FSB and the foreign SVR, but with much the same people and methods. And Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, remains the GRU. It's just that now it's Russian military intelligence.
And Vladimir Putin, drawing on the people and the methods from his background in the KGB, has now been in power for more than a quarter of a century.
And what we see in Russia is probably close to an ideal political system for Mr. Putin, where he's basically the new czar, the new leader, not exactly a communist dictator, but someone who keeps everything under control. There is not much dissent.
But if Putin is a man whose leadership style owes a lot to the Soviet model, it's important to understand just how far the political ideology that underpins his government has changed.
Interestingly also, I was asked a question recently, is Putin left-wing or right-wing? I mean, this is a transition phenomenon that has happened in Russia, which I don't think people are really following. They still sometimes think of Russia as a communist country. Not at all. Russia has moved in the pendulum to the very right. So Russia can be compared today with some ultra-right political parties in Europe. And this is where there is an element of sympathy between them. There's an element of sympathy with Mr. Trump as well, given his populist agenda.
And that element of sympathy from a far-right Russian regime intent on undermining the Western liberal democratic order and the President of the United States, the man ultimately in charge of the CIA.
The elephant trainer himself.
Yeah, I mean, that is worth examining.
I was head of counterintelligence for CIA at the time when we had some good information coming in that was telling us that the Russians were trying to influence the election in Trump's favor.
This is Susan Miller again, talking about the 2016 US presidential election.
Susan Miller was one of the leaders of a team set up under the Obama administration in 2016 to report on the possibility that Putin's Russia were looking to influence the American election.
And what we did find was multiple data points, not just on one source, but multiple data points that the Russians were indeed trying to influence the elections in Trump's favor. And that's what we basically put out in our report.
This is from the PBS NewsHour, July 31, 2025.
The report's purpose? To document what was known about how and why Russia interfered to help Mr. Trump win. An unclassified version of the report concluded Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. The report also said, we further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump.
Now, it's important to say that while they saw this evidence that Russia was trying to influence the election, that in itself is not new. Russia has been running political interference campaigns forever. And ultimately, they said that the Russian efforts were not enough to have made a difference. So Donald Trump was the legitimate winner.
Trump said at the time, okay, that sounds fine.
But that wasn't going to last for long. There are a lot of claims and counterclaims about President Trump and Russia that we won't get into here, from the Steele dossier to the FBI-led Crossfire Hurricane investigation, Trump's extraordinary summit with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in 2018, and the Mueller report. But basically, Trump's point is that there's nothing to see here. It's all a hoax.
The Russia hoax. And after the pressure on President Trump has built up for a while, he decides the public officials involved in the story are going to pay.
So, one day, a couple of years into the first Trump presidency, Susan Miller gets a call. She says a friend is warning her.
That Trump is going to go after the people that did the Russian influence paper.
Susan Miller and others from the American intelligence community have been repeatedly targeted for reporting on the level of foreign influence from Russia.
Susan Miller had to hire a lawyer at her own expense to defend herself against accusations from the first Trump administration.
Trump's Attorney General William Barr appointed a federal prosecutor, John Durham, to investigate the Trump-Russia investigation.
You know, in 2019, I had to do the Bar Durham thing, and I had a lawyer because it might lead to, you know, criminal charges, and that didn't work out. And I just go on my way, and I go to Israel, and, you know, I'm you know, doing fine. And
Susan Miller continues to have very senior roles in CIA.
And I headed up our China Mission Center and all the rest of this stuff.
Yeah, they've never been able to make anything stick against her, but that hasn't stopped the persecution. Susan Miller left the agency after 40 years and began working as a government contractor until something strange happened.
I have retired from CIA, but I still had my security clearance because you're allowed to carry it over for like up to 4 years if you get it re-upped. Like you get the polygraph again and they go and talk to neighbors again and, you know, make sure that you aren't, you know, doing cocaine at night or something like that. So I was getting ready to come up and I called my contact. And so I said, you know, which building am I going to? Where did you want me to park this time? And blah, blah, blah.
Parking is clearly quite important at CIA.
Yeah. The other thing that's quite important is your security clearance.
And my security guy goes and looks into it and he goes, "You don't have a clearance."
Initially, Susan Miller thought this was some kind of bureaucratic cock-up that could be sorted out.
I wasn't yet connecting this. I thought it was some kind of error. And then I called the people you call when you're retired and you have a question inside CIA. "Hello, my name is Susan Miller. Here's my social security number. Here's my badge number, what it was, you know, all the rest. What is going on?" And they looked at it and they said, "Your clearance has been removed." And I said, "Why? I haven't had a security violation ever. Why?" And they're like, "We don't know. We think you should call this other office."
Finally, she gets an answer.
And he just says, "Hey, you lost your clearance because Trump took it away." And I said, "What did I do wrong?" And he's like, "Good question." And he goes, "All I know is it's been taken away, and it's been taken away on order of the president."
How concerned are you about the impact of Trump on the intelligence apparatus of the United States?
Well, see, after he did me, he's done it to dozens. I think it's up to 90 people he's done this to. And here's my biggest concern. Why is he so focused on this Russia thing? Is there something there?
We've seen from these stories of double or even triple agents that it's hard to know what's really inside anyone's head.
Although it doesn't feel like Donald Trump keeps his cards that close to his chest. In any case, Susan Miller says the situation with President Trump isn't getting any better.
When you see who Trump is now, he was bad enough the first term, but now he's talking about a third term. Doesn't that sound like Putin? That's anti-constitutional. That is totally against our Constitution.
Susan Miller says there's a wider message here for anyone looking to challenge President Trump or even just understand what's behind his thinking.
All I can think is he has something really serious that he's trying to hide. That's all I can say. And he's worried about it. And what he's doing by punishing me and my team and, you know, other people around there is he's like saying, "Don't any of you ever speak out, because this is what's going to come for you." You know, that's what I feel.
So from a New Zealand perspective, that sounds pretty chilling.
It should.
In an operational sense, Susan Miller says that Trumpian influence reaches down to the people who run CIA on a daily basis. And remember, these are people who are effectively networked into our intelligence organisations here in New Zealand.
Do you feel that there has been a politicisation of the agency by the Trump administration in this regard?
100%. By the leadership, I should say. There's still a lot of really good people there, but by the leadership, 100%. They're you know, kowtowing to him, 100%.
CIA's role has always been to stick close to the president. But the way it was supposed to work was that no matter what he wanted to hear, they told him the truth.
It is no accident that The President of the United States, this one exempted, receives the presidential daily briefing that everybody knows about.
This is Kit Bennett again, talking about the PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing. President Trump apparently doesn't read it, but you can.
Yeah, you can actually see examples of this online. CIA have put up versions going up to the 1960s, although back then it was called the Central Intelligence Bulletin. Copies also go out to people listed inside, so the head of the FBI, the Vice President, Secretary of State, and so on. These are incredibly densely written. Just as an example, I randomly pulled up the one from January the 18th, 1961. It's got notes on the situation in Berlin, maps and explainers about what's happening in Laos, Soviet aircraft movements there, what the Soviet newspaper Pravda has been saying, then in the Congo, a bit of intel, but a lot of redacted stuff. Patrice Lumumba, formerly the elected leader of the Congo, has been assassinated the day before.
Not, apparently, by CIA, although it's understood they did have a plan to do it if necessary. Basically, this is an incredibly well-informed, personalised news service.
In my day, it was prepared by 40-odd people in the agency, and they would gather together the information. It would appear on the president's desk, in hard copy then, about the most important things, or the important things that the most powerful man in the world needed to know.
Now, it would be naive to think that politics and personality had never entered into that relationship between CIA leaders and the president.
Yeah, if you remember back to the second episode, when Kit Bennett arrived at CIA, Jimmy Carter was the president and Stansfield Turner was the director of the agency. But he wasn't popular.
And I remember the guy saying, you don't want to meet him, he's an asshole.
By 1981, there was a new president and a new director. And he came out to New Zealand and sat down with Kit Bennett and the chief of station here.
Reagan was in the White House, and a new director, a man named Bill Casey. And Bill Casey was a man I greatly admired because he had been in the wartime OSS.
Now, the OSS, as he's talking about there, is the Office of Strategic Services. It was set up during World War II and was, loosely speaking, the predecessor to CIA, running special operations, sabotage and so on.
So he was, he was the real deal. Although he probably went a bit far, and had he not died when he did, he probably would have ended up in jail over the Iran-Contra scandal.
Iran-Contra was yet another CIA overreach that we won't get into too deeply. It all blew up in 1986, 1987.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, the CIA director had been overseeing a scheme where US weapons were sold to Iran's Revolutionary Guard for a massive markup, and the profits were then skimmed off the top and fed to the Contras. They were a guerrilla outfit trying to bring down Nicaragua's socialist government. In principle, this was supposed to be in aid of some American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. But underneath it all was a desire for regime change in Nicaragua.
When the Iran-Contra affair came to light, it nearly brought down the Reagan administration. As Kit Bennett says, Bill Casey died just before he would probably have gone to jail.
He was the first DCI to be in the cabinet, the US cabinet. So he was in Ronald Reagan's cabinet. And he'd been Ronald Reagan's campaign director, so, a New York businessman. I was lucky enough to have lunch with him, a private lunch with him, which was just with the chief of station, myself, and his bodyguards. He said to me, the problem, I'm not going to do the accent, the problem with you guys, and he was referring clearly to Australia, New Zealand and Great Britain. He said, you have a left-wing culture. And, you have the socialist left-wing culture, which we don't have in America. And that means you are more susceptible.
Kit Bennett says he bristled at this lazy generalisation, but under the circumstances, he pushes back gently.
And I said to him, well, to get it in perspective, we've only had 3 Labor governments since the war. And he said, how come so many? And I remember thinking then, that's a bit interesting. This is not the Communist Party. This is a kind of a soft socialist, Labor Party.
So the subtext seems to be that democracy is great, provided you end up with the government that we want. It's worth underlining that this conversation was taking place in the New Zealand of the early 1980s under Prime Minister Robert Muldoon, a national government firmly in favour of a close relationship with the US. So it's interesting to hear that level of preconception from a man at the heart of American security.
When the next Labour government arrives in 1984, that is going to have all sorts of ramifications for New Zealand-US relations, the ANZUS Treaty, and for Kit Bennett's.
New Zealand became a pariah, really. And it wasn't because of the nuclear ships thing. It was because, and I remember being told this, it was because Schultz believed that he had been lied to by the Prime Minister, David Lange.
Now, there are different versions of this and no doubt deeply felt. Labour are elected on a nuclear-free ticket in 1984, but at the time, no one quite knows what that means. The Labour government in Australia arrive in 1983 saying they're nuclear-free, but that seems to be an aspiration because in practice there's no change. In France, the socialist government under Francois Mitterrand say they're anti-nuclear, but over time it becomes clear that's not the case.
To put it mildly. And with New Zealand, there's some discussion as to whether we might allow nuclear power but not nuclear weapons. It's all quite fluid for a while. And at the time, a majority of New Zealanders wanted to remain in the ANZUS alliance, but they also wanted to take a stand on the nuclear issue. David Lange seems to have wanted to find a way through that would satisfy everyone. But in the end, that didn't happen.
As I understood it, Lange said to the Americans, "Leave it with me. I'll be able to tone all this down." And of course, he wasn't able to tone it down. And I think he probably tried to. I don't know what tone it down might have meant. But Schultz gave him the time to do that. And it didn't happen. And the Americans felt really betrayed that the Prime Minister had done that. And I don't think he did it on purpose.
According to this version, what really sets the Americans off is the sense of betrayal rather than the policy itself. But either way, the end result was the same for Kit Bennett, who suddenly found himself at the end of this 2-year program that had lasted 6 years.
The nuclear ships and a passport with a silver fern on it meant that, we were not flavour of the month.
And you were sort of literally locked out of the agency. In other words, you weren't really allowed back in.
I wasn't even allowed, from parking out front and the Sarge saying, "Park where you like, Kiwi," and, to not even being allowed to go back there.
There were a few drinks organised away from Langley itself.
And I kind of felt, after all I've done. But having said that, all the officers I dealt with were kind of apologetic. They, it was the edict.
Kit Bennett says the breakup felt pretty brutal.
Thanks for all the work you've done and all that, and have a happy life. That was what it was supposed to be. But that was a bit funny when I couldn't even go to headquarters and, no one really seen you came and shook my hand. And so, that was just because of what was happening in New Zealand,
But that was more than 40 years ago now. Susan Miller says more recently, the relationship has once again become incredibly close.
I mean, when you think about the Five Eyes, we share everything with each other. If New Zealand was running a really cool, spy inside Russia, you would be sharing the information from that spy. You're not going to tell us his name or anything like that, but you're sharing it with us because Five Eyes, that's what we do.
Susan Miller describes the Five Eyes relationship as a form of teamwork.
Like when we would sit down and the Five Eyes of us and we would talk something out, we would always come up with this really great solution,
But she says the politicisation of intelligence under the Trump administration is now at a level that is going to cause issues for the rest of the team.
We've been sharing this kind of information with each other all over. And I would think that your leadership right now would be at a minimum thinking to themselves, wait a minute, I might not want to share this Russian information with this ambassador here because he's a Trump appointee. And then the chief of station is not necessarily a Trump appointee because that's actually appointed by the DCIA, but the DCIA is totally pro-Trump, and so is Tulsi Gabbard. And look at what she's doing. I would think that there would be a couple of thoughts about, what should we be doing here?
Susan Miller, the former head of CIA counterintelligence, says American intelligence, starting with CIA, should now be excluded from certain areas of Five Eyes cooperation.
I'm not going to be in that room when the Five Eyes minus America, probably sit down and say, what do we do? Do we share Russia with him? Do we even claim that we're allies anymore when he's doing this? What do we do? That's what I think is probably going on. Yeah.
What would your advice be if you were in that room?
I would say be very careful about sharing Russian information with him. China is probably okay, but I personally think, and I don't think I'm going to be telling them something they aren't already thinking, so I'm just going to go with that. They themselves have already come to this conclusion. We can't share everything with this guy. I can't trust him. Maybe they can on some China things and things like that, but when he's acting like this and they know the reality and they've worked with the U.S. government for longer than Trump has been, president twice, and they know that we in the intelligence community and State Department and everybody else, we're always very focused on our relationship with Five Eyes, et cetera, and our joint things that we do on hard targets, whether it's terrorism or China or, name something else that comes up in the day.
Susan Miller says she hopes New Zealand and the other Five Eyes partners will keep one eye on the long game.
It's super important that we have this. And I would ask them to stay as long as they can and doing what they are doing. Keep that door open. Don't completely break off from us. But they may not want to go and now declare to Americans, hey, by the way, we're running a really cool Russian down in Brazil, and we think that you guys could use this information. I think that would be a harder thing for them to do, and that would be a shame.
So, even if New Zealand puts a wall around its Russian intelligence when it comes to the US, Susan Miller says, keep a door open for more reliable future administrations.
And that seems to be what we're doing. Because if we shut out America, we might be the ones who find ourselves in the cold.
The Agency was produced, written and hosted by John Daniel and me, Guy and Espinham. Our executive producer for RNZ was John Hartevelt, and our executive producer for Bird of Paradise Productions was Noel McCarthy.
Original music by Anthony Tonnen, graphic design by Oliver Wall. For RNZ, sound production and final mix was by Mark Chesterman. Production coordinator was Brianna Uritich-Greig. Thanks to Steve Burridge, Ali Marsden, Jeremy Ansell and William Saunders. Thanks to Megan Whelan, and thanks also to Susan Baldacci.
The visual director at RNZ was Cole Eastham Farrelly, and our camera operator was Jess Charlton. Thanks also to Sarah Gaetanos for the article about Bill Such that appears on rnz.co.nz.
Thanks also to CNN, TVNZ, BBC, the ABC, Universal and Paramount. To read more about the documents and articles we've mentioned, you can go to rnz.co.nz/the agency, and you can see the links in the show notes.